Alright, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah, wa ba'd. So, after we've discussed the beliefs in Allah, we discussed belief in the prophets and revelation, we discussed belief in the Day of Judgment, or the Judgment. Then the next two things we need to discuss are belief in the Quran and belief in the Sunnah, which are the sources of Islam. So where do we get all these beliefs that we just talked about? Where do they come from in the first place? They're from the main sources of Islam, which are the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that today. And this is kind of like a good order to follow when you're explaining Islam to somebody. You kind of give them, this is what Islam believes, this is where it comes from, and then we'll talk about other stuff afterwards. So the Quran. So what are we supposed to believe about the Quran? Now, what is the Quran? The Quran is the final revelation that has been sent for the guidance of all people living today. And it was sent to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So what does a Muslim have to believe about the Quran? This is more about detailed beliefs about the Quran. A Muslim has to believe that every single verse has been given to us from Allah. Every single verse in the Quran is from Allah, and it has reached us without any type of corruption, distortion, addition, subtraction, interpolation, anything like that. If we believe that it's been altered, then we have a fundamental flaw in our belief system. So it's very important that we believe every single aspect of the Quran, every single part of the Quran, every verse, every meaning of the Quran has reached us the way that Allah wanted it to be originally revealed, such that we're able to potentially understand it correctly. Okay, so that's very important. It's very important to understand that, because other people in other religions don't have this belief in their own faith, because they realized, many of them, that their books have not been preserved. So they're very comfortable making the compromise and saying, yeah, we don't believe that this entire book is from Allah. We believe that either the meanings are from Allah, but the words are from human beings, or we believe that most of it has been preserved from Allah, but they don't believe in the entire thing. So for us, we need to be very clear that this is not something that we can ever compromise on, and there are very good reasons, which we're going to be talking about. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first of all, promised in the Quran, He said, indeed it is we who sent down the reminder, referring to the Quran, and indeed we will be its guardian. Meaning that Allah has promised that He is going to preserve and protect the Quran. What does the preservation and protection of the Quran entail? It entails the protection of the words. It entails the protection of the language. Right? It entails the protection of people who can potentially understand the book. It entails protection of the Arabic language as well. Because if no one can read Arabic, and the original Quran is in Arabic, you can't understand it. It entails all of these things that are going to be protected, such that people as a whole will have an opportunity to be able to access the book in exactly the way that Allah revealed it in the first place and the way that He wanted it to be. So this is very important to understand. And we must follow every part of the Quran. We must believe in every part of the Quran, and we must know that we're supposed to follow every single part of the Quran, and not just follow part and disbelieve in part. And we're supposed to adjust our behavior in accordance with what the Quran says, rather than the other way around. And the reason why this is so important is because it's becoming more and more prevalent today that people would like to either take part of the Quran and abandon part of it, or they would like to take some verses of the Quran and adjust their meanings to fit what they feel the Quran should be, even though it may not be something along those lines. So Allah said in rebuke to the children of Israel, Bani Israel, the previous Muslim nation before us, do you believe in a part of the book and reject another part? This is a very common phenomenon, particularly in countries like America today. So if you go and you check with other people, you go and you ask them, well, what do you think about your book? Say, oh yeah, it's a very good book, and I like to approach religion in the sense that, I like a lot of the stories, and I like a lot of the morals aspects, and I like a lot of the virtues. Well, do you like everything about it? No. This part, these verses and that verses and things about hellfire and things about this, I don't really like that. So, okay, when you say you don't like it, what do you mean? So, no, I don't really believe in that. Oh, so you don't even believe in it. So, no, I don't believe in that part. So you believe in basically the parts that you like and the parts that you're not comfortable with, you just don't believe in them. So yeah, it's very common. Anyone ever met somebody who believes something like this? Only a few people? You guys don't interact enough with non-Muslims. That's what it is. But really, you're not speaking enough with people. This is the vast majority of people, at least in like Southern California. Vast majority of people who follow a religion, they kind of have this mentality. Whether it's Buddhist, or whether it's a Christian, or whether it's a Jew, or whether it's some person from another faith. Very, very common behavior. If you ask them, most of them, and they're very comfortable with it. So we as Muslims, we have the opposite understanding. The understanding is that it's our responsibility to adjust our behavior. So you say, okay, this verse, this verse is about hellfire, really scary, and the Christian church and all of that, dark ages and everything used to scare people. So you know what? This kind of bothers me in the sense that I'm just not so comfortable with these verses. What should be your response as a Muslim? Your response is, I need to analyze myself. Why is this bothering me? And how can I fix myself so that it's not bothering me? If either my interpretation of these verses are wrong, or my understanding of what the book of Allah should be is wrong. So I need to fix myself. Either I need to fix my understanding of what this means by going and asking somebody else, or I need to fix myself and say, well, why does something like this bother me? Why does it bother me so much that a criminal who steals is going to be punished in this way? So, well, it seems inhumane. Having the question in your mind, it seems like it's this way, that's not a problem. The problem is when you don't try to resolve it. Or when you try to resolve it by saying, I don't accept this part. So I'm going to stick with my feeling, and I'm going to adjust the Quran, or I'm going to remove a part of the Quran and say, well, my feeling takes precedence over what this verse seems to be saying pretty clearly. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, oh, I don't accept this part. So this is what it means to accept the entire book. Right? So we need to look into ourselves. If we see an issue or something like that, we need to realize when we accept this book, we accept the entire thing. Because it's from Allah. So then adjustments need to be made primarily in ourselves or in our own understanding. But we don't go and we throw some other understanding and say, well, I think it should mean this. This is not the way to do it. So it's important to understand that. Miraculous nature of the Quran. The second thing is we need to understand the Quran is a miracle. The Quran is a miracle in itself. And Allah challenged people to bring something like it, which is part of the definition of a miracle was what? Definition of miracle, number one is, nobody else can produce it. Okay, no normal human being can bring something like it. Okay, number one. Number two, that's the same thing, supernatural. So supernatural such that no one can bring something like it. Number two, they can't bring it about on their own. Okay? There's a challenge behind it. That's another point. Very important. It's challenging other people, okay? And it's coming to only prophets. So these are very important points. So the Quran is a miracle in that sense. So Allah challenged to bring something like it in many different verses of the Quran. This is just one. Tell the people, if all of the mankind, all people, and all the jinn, even spiritual beings, if they all gathered together, all their research institutions and money invested and all of that stuff, you pay everyone to, the brightest minds to come together. In order to produce the like of this Quran, they could not produce the like of it, even if they were to each other assistants. Even if they helped each other as a whole group, they wouldn't be able to do it ever. So there's a challenge built into the Quran. Now, the other miracles that other prophets did, like transforming a staff into a snake, getting the camel out of the mountain, splitting the Red Sea, all the other miracles that different prophets did, they were temporary. And they were designed for their specific group of people. They were designed particularly for the people who are witnessing that. So when those people witnessed that miracle, the other people who were not present, they heard the story, but it's not the same as the miracle. Right? Hearing a story about what happened is not going to be the same as actually witnessing the miracle. So the Quran is different from that miracle in the sense that it's designed for all people, universal of time and place, and it's manifested in 6 different ways. So the 6 different ways that it manifests itself as a miracle is number one, that it's been preserved without any corruption or without any change. So the thing is that Allah promised in the Quran that He's going to preserve it, and it's been preserved, and there's almost no other religious book that anyone can even claim of anywhere near this length that's been preserved intact. That everyone is very clear about it, that yes, it's been preserved, and we know that this is the same revelation that was given to the original prophet. So this is number one. That's a miracle in itself, in the fact that millions of people have memorized the entire thing. And the way that it's been preserved, the way that it's reached us, is a miracle in and of itself. Number two is the linguistic beauty. So this is all stuff that we're going to cover more detail in a Quran class that we're going to cover next year. But this is just kind of an introduction to it. So there's linguistic aspect to the Quran, such that it caused people who, when they heard it and they tried to understand it, people who were familiar with the Arabic language, they just realized that this is something beyond the production of a human being. People who just were so amazed, so shocked by the best poets of the day, realized that this is something that, it's not something that a normal person can produce. And you can't understand that unless you are an expert in the language, or at least you have some understanding of the language. You can somehow experience it, but not at the same level as someone who's an expert in the field. So there's a linguistic aspect as well in the Quran. The third is the meaning and the content of the message is miraculous in and of itself, in the sense that the message that it's bringing and the what it can do for society and the beliefs and everything about the content and the message and the meaning is miraculous in and of itself. Number four is the prophecies. So the prophecies about the Roman Empire going to be defeating the Persian Empire in this many years, the prophecies about certain other things going to be happening, they were all on the dot. And any other prophecy that occurred, either it happened, but it's never been contradicted. Any other unfulfilled prophecy has never been contradicted. Whereas other people who make prophecies, they always have like a rate of 50%, let's say 70%, even if it's 99%. If they get one wrong, it means that they're false in their claims. So prophecies were correct. Number five, the accuracy of unknown descriptions. So things which were described in the Quran which were unknown could not be known before. So for example, stories about certain prophets that later on we realized there's no way that the Prophet, peace be upon him, could have known the details of this story. And then you go and you look at some archaeological find, or you go and you look at the revelation from a scripture from another group, and it happened to be exactly the way that they had described it, but there's no way that actually reached the Prophet physically. So that's miraculous aspect. And also in the same category, observations about the world, what people call the scientific miracles in the Quran. So for example, the fact that fresh water and salt water, they're not going to mix. This is something that the Prophet, peace be upon him, could not venture into an area where it happened that these two oceans, or these two fresh and salt water, that they're going to be mixing, and that he can see under the water and he can figure out that they're not going to come together. Development of the embryo. Right, in the womb. So how it develops in the stages which it goes through, it's not something which he could have known. So some people have actually said, no, he had a very advanced microscope, back in the desert, and the only way to explain is he had really advanced technology and he knew how to check. But obviously there's really not any basis for believing that he had a microscope, or in 1400 years ago in the desert of Arabia, in the city of Mecca. And six, the scope and the speed of the revolution that it brought about. The amount of change that it had, no society has ever changed that fast and on that large a scale. In terms of Arabia, in a few years, from what it used to be, people are drinking, people are worshipping idols, people are into prostitution, people are into gambling, and all of a sudden, all these major vices wiped out completely. Even if they didn't become the most perfect of people, the main vices in society wiped out. And if you look at, United States of America trying to prohibit alcohol in the 30s, complete failure with the backing of the army. You go and you look at other people trying to change society, not going to have the same effect. So these are all miraculous aspects of the Quran. The main thing, you don't need to know all the details of it. The main thing is understanding the Quran is a miracle. So there is something special about the Quran. It's not just a book. It's more than a book, it's a miraculous aspect to it. The next thing is that the Quran is the word of Allah. Quran, the word of Allah, has a number of connotations. The first connotation is that every verse is directly from Allah and it's reached us, right? Now, when it comes to the subject of theology or Islamic beliefs, there's been a lot of debates in history that have taken place. The question of whether the Quran is the actual word of Allah or not the actual word of Allah, there's been actually a lot of debates regarding that. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of why that is until the last class. Probably the last class we're going to talk more about it. There's been different groups saying different things. What we need to know is that this became a really, really big issue in history. Okay? Whether the Quran was created or whether it was uncreated. So we're not going to get into details today, but what we should know is the answer to how to address this. So what is the Quran? The actual speech of Allah, the Quran is the actual speech of Allah, meaning this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly communicating to us. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the Quran, from that perspective, is Allah's direct communication. Now what if you say, well, what about the actual Quran? Like, so when we're reciting the Quran, the voice that's coming out, we call it Quran, right? So does that mean that that thing that just came out of our mouth, that's also the word of Allah? Or is it my word? That's the question. Right? This is, for most people, this is the most irrelevant discussion. It's never crossed my mind. Doesn't make any sense. I don't need to talk about this. You're right. It's not very relevant at all for most people. But the fact that it was such an important issue in history, for reasons which I'll explain later on, we should at least have a good understanding of an answer to it. So the answer to it is that when the Quran was communicated from Allah, that was the word of Allah directly. When we recite the Quran, or when we write down the Quran, we have sound waves that come out of our mouth. We have the ink, right, that's written. We call that the Quran. Recitation of the Quran, writing of the Quran, all of that. That represents the word of Allah, but it's not the direct word of Allah, right? From one perspective, it's the voice of the person who's speaking, right? Which is Allah. So let's take an example of a tape recorder. All right, MP3 recorder, you record somebody's voice, right? And you're playing it back. When you're playing the voice back, is that the voice of the speaker, the person who said the words, or is it the voice of your stereo system? Do you understand the question? So from one perspective, it's the voice of the person who's actually speaking, obviously, right? But from another perspective, the actual sound waves that are coming out are from the stereo system, right? From the microphone system or something like that. So you're probably thinking, what's the point of all this, right? Don't worry right now. I'm going to explain to you later what the point of this is, as long as you understand it. It's very simple to understand. Hopefully it's clear. So from one perspective, it's the word of Allah, and from another perspective, when somebody quotes a verse of the Quran, it's the word or sound waves of that person, but it represents the direct word of Allah. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty clear. And that's all we need to know about that for now, and we'll come back to this issue later on. The next point is the Sunnah. Okay, so now we understand we have to believe in the Quran, the entire Quran, we have to accept all of it. That's the primary source, the number one foundation of Islam. The second foundation of Islam is the Sunnah. Now the Sunnah, the word itself, refers to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Okay, so we're not talking about formal definitions, we're just talking about general religious Islamic teachings of the Prophet. That is referred to as the Sunnah. Okay, so let's talk about this. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was a teacher who was supposed to explain the message of Islam. He was not a postman, right? He was not somebody who just simply conveys the message and lets other people understand it. So let's understand what is the function and what was the role of the Prophet, peace be upon him. What was his function and what was his role? Some people have become confused regarding this issue, and they think that he's like a postman. What does a postman do? Delivers the mail. It's not his job to open the mail. In fact, he's not even supposed to open it, right? Delivers the mail, not supposed to read it, and it's not his responsibility. So if you open up the mail in front of the postman, you read it, what is this? I can't believe they sent me this. Can you explain this to me? It's not the postman's responsibility to explain anything to you. His job is to simply hand it to you and walk away. So some people think that verses in the Quran which talk about the Prophet, peace be upon him, is saying that you are just a messenger. Your duty is only to convey the message, nothing else. They think that, oh, that's referring to the Prophet, peace be upon him, as being like a postman. You just give the book to everyone. Here's the Quran. I'm going to quote the Quran for you. You memorize it, and I'm not going to explain anything to you. Or if I say something, you don't have to listen to what I have to say. My job was to give you the book, and that's it. There's nothing else beyond that. So if we understand the Prophet as being something like that, then we fall into a problematic position. Okay? Instead, we have to view the Prophet, peace be upon him, as a teacher. He was a teacher who is sent to teach the Quran, to give you the Quran, and to teach the Quran in all its aspects. Teaching implies teaching you the words of the Quran, explaining to you the meanings of the Quran, explaining you how to implement the Quran in your life, and even above and beyond that, helping you to fix yourself so that you'll actually accept the Quran. It's actually four main functions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which we'll talk about that in another class in more detail. But this is a general overview. So what is the proof for that? The proof for that is a number of things. First of all, you do not find, if you study the life of the Prophet, you do not find him being like a parrot in the sense that every time you ask him something, he just quotes a verse of the Quran to you. And you go and you ask him, well, what is your opinion? What is your advice on this? He just quotes a verse of the Quran to you. And then he doesn't explain it. What does that tell you? He didn't confine himself only to quoting a bunch of verses. What happens today, the reason why people have misunderstood this point, is because they have an issue with following the Sunnah or following Hadith for whatever reasons. We'll talk a little bit about it. So they want to be Quran-only Muslims. Says, I'm Quran only. And there's a whole group called the Quraniyun or the Quranists. We only follow Quran, we don't follow anything else. The reason why they try to justify themselves, saying that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was like a postman. He just delivers the Quran to us. It's our job to read the scripture. And that's a very, fits into the modern perspective of the Quran is like, it's in my hands. I'm going to read it. I'm going to interpret it how I want to. And no one should be telling me how I should interpret it. So if I don't like your interpretation, I'm going to go ahead and come up with my own interpretation. And this is a group, unfortunately, that's a very influential group. They're influential in a lot of circles. They're even in the prison system, American prison system, spreading their literature and telling people that this is the way to do it and all of that. This constitutes a serious threat to understanding Islam. So we have to be very clear and understand that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not come just to hand the Quran over. He came to teach the Quran as well. So one proof is that he never just kept on quoting verses. He actually extrapolated and explained the message in detail through his teachings as well as through his lifestyle. So there's words that he used to teach, and the things he used to do through his lifestyle, that's actually a proof that he's actually teaching other things. Now, all the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, relating to Islam were based on the Quran. Obviously, he's not going to be deviating from the Quran. They're all based on the Quran, either directly or indirectly. So what does directly mean? Directly means that he received a direct revelation from Allah that this verse means this and you should explain to somebody else. Or he received a direct revelation from Allah that you should teach the people this, although it's not going back and referring directly to a verse of the Quran. What does indirectly mean? Indirectly means that the Prophet, peace be upon him, gave an interpretation, his own interpretation to the Quran. He's making his own tafsir, his own explanation of the Quran, and he's conveying it to other people, saying, this is what the Quran means. This is what I think the Quran means. Now, because he's a prophet, if he made a mistake, Allah would come and correct him. Because Allah would not allow a prophet to be teaching something incorrect. And of course, he's the most knowledgeable about the Quran, so he's not likely to make a mistake. But if he ever makes a mistake, Allah will immediately correct him and not allow that error to persist. So that's what it means by indirectly. Okay, directly or indirectly. Because it doesn't make any sense to say that Allah would allow him to teach something wrong about Islam. Okay? Now you see, if you notice very carefully, if you look carefully, you will see two statements here. All the teachings of the Prophet related to Islam. Allah would not allow him to teach something wrong about the message of Islam. Does that mean that the Prophet, peace be upon him, could ever make a mistake in his life about something completely disconnected from the Quran or from Islam? Yes, he could. So, for example, I'll give you a hypothetical example, then I'll give you a real example. Hypothetical example, if somebody were to walk up to the Prophet and say, look, I have two things in my hand, right? Imagine one of his wives come just to play, a joke with him. I have two things in my hand, okay? Let's say it's a ring or something. Which hand is it in? And he picks the wrong hand. He says, okay, I'm guessing this hand. And he picks the wrong hand. Does that affect his prophethood? Does that alter the message of Islam at all? No, this has nothing to do with his prophethood, the message of Islam, the Quran, the Sunnah, what you need to do religiously. It has no connection whatsoever. So if he were to make a mistake in something like this, someone says, oh, how could the Prophet make a mistake? This is nothing. This doesn't have any effect on the religion at all. So making a mistake on something like this, there's no reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to keep him protected from something like this. So there's some examples. I'll give you one example. One example was, there were some trees which were not bearing proper fruit. So the Prophet ﷺ just made a casual remark. He said, what you guys are doing, this technique that you use, the trees were bearing fruit. And then he saw what they were doing, the technique they were using in order to cause the fruit to grow. He said, this is pretty strange technique. Why are you guys doing this? This doesn't really seem to make sense. So he didn't say anything more than that. They went and they changed the technique. They stopped using that technique. The next season, harvest came, fruits didn't grow properly. So they came back and they said, oh Messenger of Allah, you told us not to do that, and now the fruits didn't come. So this is a problem, what does this mean? I mean, does it mean that, you told us not to do that? We thought it's like coming from Allah and we're not supposed to do this anymore. He said, I'm just a human. I was just telling you that. This is just my observation. This is just strange what you're doing. I don't know why you guys do it. This is not something Islamically, religiously that I was telling you. So when I tell you something about the religion, you need to accept it. When I tell you something else just randomly about some random thing that I see here and there, you don't have to accept it because it's not it's not a religious position. So he made his position very clear. So that's kind of important to understand. We will talk more about that though in another class. But anything that came pertaining to Islam could never be wrong. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never allow him to remain in a state of error, so that he's teaching something wrong to other people. Okay, so that's important. Yes. Yeah, it's somewhat related. That's more to his behavior though. It's more to his behavior. So he frowned at a person and then he turned away. So that's more related to his behavior rather than it was his interpretation that this is not wrong. So yeah, it's somewhat related. What is the function of the Sunnah? Right? So it's indirect revelation. The same way, like the Quran is binding and we have to believe in everything, obedience to the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is mandatory. It's 100% mandatory because it equates to the obedience of Allah. So obeying the messenger equates to the obedience of Allah, and Allah is very clear about that. He who obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah. He who obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah. And there are so many different verses concerning this, which again we will cover more in detail in another class. But this is very important to understand, because there are people who have this understanding that we follow Quran and the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they're nice to have, but we don't have to follow them, right? Because Sunnah, when we hear the word Sunnah, we think the word Sunnah from an Islamic law perspective. And Sunnah from an Islamic law perspective has a completely different meaning. So the word Sunnah we're talking about means the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The word Sunnah, when you're in a different field, the field of Islamic law, what does the word Sunnah mean? It means something recommended. You say, well, it's just Sunnah, it's just recommended. So if it's recommended, why are you saying it's mandatory? We're in a different field now. The word sunnah, like many other words, in a different field has a completely different connotation. It's like being in a different country, right? So if you use, in the UK, if you're in England, and you use this one English word, and you come to America, use the same English word, it has a completely different meaning, right? Like colloquial use, if you use the term wicked, right? You say, this is wicked. Okay, what does that mean in America? Something is wicked. It's evil, bad. What does it mean in the UK? Anyone from the UK? Wicked. This is awesome. This is amazing. That's what it means. So you're looking at the guy and saying, this new computer that came out, this is wicked. It looks like a good computer to me. It doesn't seem evil or anything. That's the usage. So you cannot apply the term sunnah here in our discussion. That's coming from Islamic law, which is a completely different class, completely different subject. Don't mix terms up. Okay, so be very clear about that. So sunnah is referring to the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, within the teachings, there's mandatory, recommended, disliked, prohibited. There's different range. But we're just talking about the word sunnah as being the teaching. So the teachings of the Prophet as a whole are binding and mandatory. We have to take them into consideration. So if he says something is obligatory, it becomes obligatory. If he said something is recommended, then it becomes recommended. If he said something is disliked, it becomes disliked, meaning it's mandatory to consider it to be disliked. Okay? So hopefully that clarifies a little bit. So in essence, that means that there's no difference in the binding authority of the Quran and in the binding authority of the Sunnah for a Muslim in terms of what they have to follow. So Muslim has to follow equally the Quran and equally the Sunnah on the same level. Now we're not using the word hadith, we're not talking about authenticity, we're not talking about anything, we're just talking about in a conceptual framework. The teachings of the Prophet and the teachings of Allah, the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet are on the same level from that perspective. Okay? Not from the perspective of authenticity, but from the perspective of you need to follow it. Same level, there's no difference between that. So, why is this? And why is there a sunnah? And why didn't Allah put everything in the Quran? Why did there have to be something separate? So, we'll hint at a little bit. They're inseparable and they need each other. Each one requires the other. So the Quran requires the sunnah and the sunnah requires the Quran. The Quran pretty much serves as like a blueprint. Okay? Quran is like a blueprint of a building. And the sunnah is the actual building itself. It's the details and the entire structure. So if you take a look and you say, okay, well, look at the Quran. The Quran tells you you need to pray. Does it tell you exactly how to pray? It doesn't say how to pray, not in detail. Quran says you have to give zakah. Does it tell you how to give zakah? In what terms? Of all the details? It doesn't. The sunnah is there for that. The Quran tells you this ruling. It tells you this ruling. It tells you need to do this or stay away from this. All the details are not there. And there's a reason for that. Well, I'll hint at it, although we'll talk about more later. The thing is, imagine if the Quran was full of all the details like a book of Islamic law. Imagine we have to read that in prayer every single day. That the requirements of the wudu are that you wash your face and you wash your hands and you wash your thing. So the Quran has about one verse on that. And then it says, and then the recommended actions are that you use a toothbrush before you begin. And you say Bismillah before you begin. And you make sure to get your fingers inside your ears. And you make sure to wipe behind the ears. And you make sure to wipe 1/4 or the entire head. And make sure that the water actually reaches the hair. And make sure that when you're wiping the neck that you do this. Would you be able to stand through that kind of prayer? The Quran would lose its beauty, right? It wouldn't be able to have all of that detail. If you said zakah qualifies for people who are in this state. And if you give in this state, then it's going to be like this. It's going to be really, really tedious. So it's a blessing from Allah that we have the two sources separated. One of them is the details, which we don't have to, be reciting for, it was an act of worship. And the other is more of a blueprint. It has the beauty, linguistic beauty built in and all of that. Right? If you look at other scriptures, go and look at other people's scriptures, and they don't have this differentiation. Their books are kind of combined with everything together. So go and try and take another scripture, and just imagine if you had to read that and listen to that during the prayer. You get lost, you get bored. whole lineages and genealogies and this detail on this detail, and if this animal has this kind of hoof clothed in between, and if it has this and it chews the cud and it does this and it does that, you're like, where is this going? So in terms of, this is a huge blessing from Allah. So realize that, inshallah. Alright, so Quran is a huge blueprint. Sunnah is a blueprint, Quran is a blueprint, Sunnah is the detailed structure. Okay? So last thing we're going to talk about is faith and disbelief. So what is faith, meaning iman, the term iman? What does it consist of, and what is the definition of it, and what is disbelief? So what is the difference between belief and disbelief? And when does somebody become a believer, and when does somebody become a disbeliever? And when are you allowed to call somebody a believer, and when are you allowed to call them a disbeliever? Right? It becomes a very important and contentious topic, because you're going to be calling this person, man, this person's not a believer anymore, or this person just accepted Islam. No, this person, I know he's a Muslim. Although he's not saying that he's a Muslim, I still believe that he's a Muslim. Right? So when do you do that, and when does that happen? So let's talk about faith. So the definition of a Muslim is somebody, the high level definition, somebody who believes in every single thing that the Prophet, peace be upon him, brought in his capacity as a messenger. Okay, in his capacity as a messenger. So you believe everything that the Prophet, peace be upon him, brought. That's like a high level, theoretical statement right there. When somebody makes this claim, that yes, I'm willing to believe in everything that the Prophet ﷺ brought. So what did he bring? He brought the Quran and his own teachings. He taught. So you believe in his teachings, you believe in the Quran, you believe in his actions that he did, that they were really, that he's a true prophet, all of that. So you believe everything that he said, and everything that he brought, and everything that he did. So from that perspective, that's what the definition of being a Muslim actually is. Okay? So why is that important? This became another historical discussion. What if a Muslim commits sins? Right? They commit sins. Let's say they commit the worst sin you can possibly imagine. They kill 1 million people, they drink 1 million cans of beer, and they commit adultery 1 million times, and they do, whatever else there is. Right? They're like absolute worst person. But in the end of the day, they say, and in their heart, they feel, I still believe in every single thing that the Prophet brought. But I'm just doing all these sins, or whatever weird justification they have. If a person is in that state and they're doing the worst things, they are still a Muslim at the end of the day. So sins, no matter how bad these sins are, no matter how many, no matter how severe, when we say sins, we're talking about actions. Okay, we're not talking about the belief part of sins. The actions themselves, it does not remove somebody from being a believer. So that's the basic principle. Whatever sins you commit, you're still going to be a Muslim. Now, should you be happy about that? And obviously no. Right? This is not for you, by the way. So remember, from a practical perspective, this is not talking about you. That, if you commit sins, then don't worry, you're still a Muslim. This is talking about your judgment of somebody else. If you see somebody else committing sins, remember that they're still a Muslim. That's the main point. So in case you're thinking, oh, I'm okay then. No, you're not okay. You're in trouble if you're committing sins. When you're judging somebody else, this person is drinking. This person is committing adultery. This person killed somebody else. You say, man, that guy can't be a Muslim. Understand what your statement of that person cannot be a Muslim means. There are ramifications to that statement. So when you say like that person, he's not a real Muslim. The word real is important to prefix. Okay, so as long as somebody believes in all of that. However, if somebody rejects anything that is well known about Islam, then the person becomes a disbeliever. Now this is also important. They reject something that's well known about Islam. So what is well known? Well known means that it's very clearly an intrinsic aspect of Islam. So clear, there cannot be any shadow of a doubt, or even you cannot even really conceive of a difference of opinion on that subject. So what are some of the things? Okay, some of the things says, let's just think some obvious things. Somebody says, you know what? I believe in Allah and I believe in His Messenger, but I also believe in the Trinity. I believe that God is three in one. This is so clear cut in the Quran that there's no way somebody can reconcile these beliefs. This is well known to be something that's completely against Islam. There cannot even be two opinions about it. So if somebody believes something like that, they're out of Islam. They're out of Islam. Okay? And they've not entered Islam properly if they already had that belief. And the thing is, this can happen. I mean, has anyone ever met somebody like this? You think this can never happen? It's happened to me. I've met somebody who actually says, yeah, I believe in Allah, but then I also believe in the Trinity as well. How does this work? How can this work? There's no way that this person can be classified as a believer. This person didn't understand what they were saying or getting into when they accepted Islam in the first place. What else is well known about Islam? The fact that there are 5 prayers, right? The fact that there are daily prayers every day that you have to pray. Right? This is something so clearly well known about Islam. If somebody says, no, I believe that there are 4 prayers in the day, not 5. This person says the testification of faith. They say, I believe in the Quran, I believe in this, I believe in that, but they're disqualified, they become a disbeliever. Because this is something so well known in Islam that it cannot be rejected. Something like fasting in the month of Ramadan. Something like paying zakah. Not the details of zakah, whether it's, let's give you a little bit more detail. If somebody says, I believe in zakah and I know we have to give zakah, but I just don't accept the whole 2.5% thing. He came up with some 3% figure somehow. It's good, he's paying more, right? Let's say he came up with a 2% figure. You say, how did you come up with 2? What happened to the 0.5%? You say, no, I don't believe in that. This is a sin, huge problem, no basis for it whatsoever. But the whole 2.5 aspect of the zakah is not the essence of the zakah. So if he's believing in zakah, he's believing in the entire concept, but his concept is just so messed up. It's just wrong, he doesn't understand what to give, how to give, who to give it to, or anything like that. The person remains a believer because the part that's well known about Islam is that Muslims have to pay zakah. That's the clear part. Any other mistake he makes along the way, or he figures he messes up in the prayer, thinking that you're supposed to do 2 bowings or something like that, something really strange like that. That's something that can perhaps be overlooked. But the principle is there. Someone comes and says, pork is allowed in Islam. It's okay, we can eat some bacon, we can eat some this, we can eat some that. There's no problem, nothing wrong with eating pork. The word pig actually had a different connotation. Pig used to mean such and such, and it didn't actually mean pig. It was referring to some guy back in the days. He used to eat a lot, so it was referring to that guy. We shouldn't go near him, or some weird interpretation. There's no basis for that. So if a person believes in that, person is outside the fold of Islam. Why is this important to understand? These are the 2 extremes that you need to understand, and we have both extremes in our community. The extremes are that when somebody commits some really bad sin or even a small sin, they're labeled as a disbeliever, even though they actually believe in everything else in Islam. This is an extreme. And the other extreme is that somebody goes and rejects a fundamental aspect of Islam. I don't believe in fasting. So you don't fast, or you don't believe in fasting? No, I don't believe that we are supposed to fast. And they say, well, no, the guy is a Muslim at the end of the day. Because he says, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. He says that he said the testification of faith. Just because you say the testification of faith and then you nullify it by your belief or your disbelief in something which is an essential part of Islam, it does take you out of the fold of Islam. Even if you keep on saying the declaration of faith again and again, we say, no, I'm never going to believe that we have to fast in Ramadan. That testification of faith doesn't do you any good because you've rejected something which is well known to be part of Islam. There's only one exception to the rule. And the exception to the rule is if somebody makes an interpretation of something to be different and they're legitimately ignorant about that, they need to clear their ignorance immediately. Okay, that's the only thing, and it's still recommended for them to re-declare their testification of faith. All right. So these are things that are well known. Like for example, prohibition of interest, prohibition of riba, something well clear cut in Islam. If somebody believes that interest is allowed, it's perfectly fine to take it. It's a problem. Now, how they define interest, and they say, oh, there's exception to the rule because we live in this country, we live in that country, that doesn't make them a disbeliever. But the concept itself, if somebody says you can eat dead animals, even though you're not, even though you're not starving to death. So the concept of meta, carrion, dead flesh, just died on the floor, and you say, oh no, we can eat that, no problem. We're gonna go ahead and eat that, and there's no issue. Believing in something like that can actually render you outside the fold of Islam because it's so well known. But then if you start debating and say, no, the definition of the animal died, 5 seconds, this and that, and this is something different. So we're talking about belief and disbelief here. So what does it mean that somebody's a Muslim? Why is it important to judge that somebody else is a Muslim? We're not supposed to be judgmental, right? So why are we judging people? Is this too judgmental? Right? We live in a very sensitive society, right? Everyone is, you don't judge me, right? Only God can judge me. Very, typical, right? We have people wearing shirts, only God can judge me. You are not my boss, and whatever it is. Why is it that we're supposed to judge people? From a perspective, we don't judge the details of their hearts, but we judge the outward aspect for certain reasons. Do you walk up, if somebody comes and says salam to you, salam alaikum, are you obligated to respond back to them? If they're a Muslim, you're obligated. So if you think the guy in front of you is not a Muslim, you don't have the same obligation. You can say, hey, what's up? You don't have to respond because he's not a Muslim. Somebody comes and offers you meat and says, you know what, I just said Bismillah and I just slaughtered this animal and I cooked it for you. If he's a Muslim, you can eat it. And if he's not, and you don't consider him to be a Muslim, and you don't consider him to be a Jew or Christian either, then he's not somebody you can even eat their meat from. So you have to make a judgment. If somebody dies, are you going to pray a funeral prayer over them or not? You have to decide whether or not this person is a Muslim. If they're not a Muslim, you're not praying the funeral prayer over non-Muslims. You're not burying him in the Muslim cemetery, or you're not going to bury him in the way of a Muslim if he's not a Muslim in the first place. Right? So all of these things have ramifications, and you need to judge people because of these reasons. Not because your judgment is going to matter what you think in the eyes of Allah. That's not going to make any difference. So if you judge wrong, it's not your problem as long as you use the right principles. If you use these principles and you did it correctly, and it turns out the guy, he wasn't speaking the truth. In his heart, he was a true believer, but you declared him to be a disbeliever for whatever reason. And somehow he was concealing his faith because somebody put like a device, on his body, and they said, if you don't say this, we're going to push this button, and all of a sudden it's going to blow up and you're going to die. All right? Or we have like, a drone following you, right? And the drone is going to drop a bomb on you the moment you don't make this. And the person saying, my life is in danger, my family's life in danger. I'm just going to make this statement in front of somebody else because, I'm allowed to do this. I'm compelled to make this statement, or they're going to kill me and my family, and they're going to blow up the other village, for example. And the person's making this statement, and you declare them from your statement, you're not a real Muslim, right? And then all of a sudden, the government betrays them or whatever, and they drop the drone bomb on them and attack them anyway. Do you bury them as a Muslim or a non-Muslim? You're going to bury them as a non-Muslim, because what you know about them is that they're not a Muslim. But in their heart, they were a true Muslim. So on the Day of Judgment, they're not going to be held accountable for what they did. They're going to be judged by what's in their heart, and you're not going to be held accountable for your judging them to be a non-Muslim because you didn't know, because you applied the correct criteria. Make sense? And vice versa. And the other way around. So if you judge somebody to be a Muslim and they're not really a Muslim, and they look like they were a Muslim and they were actually a hypocrite, it's not going to be your responsibility that you judge them incorrectly. Okay? So what does that mean further? So further, that means also not only do you greet them, not only do you bury them, not only do you eat from them, you're allowed to pray behind them. And this becomes a bigger important issue. Who are you allowed to pray behind? If you refuse to pray behind somebody, and you're not doing it out of what's recommended. Somebody doesn't know how to lead the prayer or something, you can tell them, look, it's not recommended for you to be leading the prayer. But if they lead the prayer, and you say, I'm not going to pray behind you because I don't consider you to be a Muslim, that's a major thing, right? So, and if you know that someone is not a Muslim, because let's say they say, oh, I reject the last verse of the Quran. I accept everything else, but I don't accept the last verse. It's just not in my belief. Are you allowed to pray behind that person? You're not allowed to pray behind them anymore. This has a ramification, so you have to know something. So I'll give you an example. You say, well, who would do something like that? Okay, there was a guy in Tucson who translated the entire Quran into English. His name was Rashid Khalifa. And he removed 2 verses from the Quran. He said, I don't believe in these 2 verses. They shouldn't be there from the Quran. So he removed the 2 verses of the Quran. And his translation of the Quran is being distributed, to different people in prisons, and it's free online, and you could buy it on Amazon. Don't buy it, by the way. You can, it's available and all that stuff. Don't support, this stuff. So anyway, so somebody like this, if you knew this about him, would you be allowed to pray behind him? You're not allowed to pray behind him. You say, no, but he prays 5 times a day. He gives zakah. He seems like a nice guy. He quotes verses of the Quran. This guy could quote you Quran left and right. Doesn't mean anything. Because his faith is not correct, because he's rejected something which absolutely has to be believed in by Muslims. Okay? So when we're talking about judging other people, we only judge the external aspect. Anything else beyond these criteria, we're not supposed to judge them. So you don't go and say, oh man, this guy looks like a hypocrite. I think he's going to hell for sure. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to make any statement like that. Okay? So let's see, is the hopeful thing here? So the thing is, we should understand that as Muslims, we should be hopeful that other Muslims are going to be forgiven by Allah for their sins. We should have the hope that other people will be forgiven for their sins, but at the same time, we should also be afraid that Allah might punish them. So there's a combination, there's a mix between hope in Allah's mercy and fear of Allah's justice. And Ibn al-Qayyim, one of the scholars of Islam, he gives a great example. He says, you see a bird with 2 wings. One of those wings is hope, and the other wing is fear. So if you don't balance both out, where's that bird going to go when it's in the air? Going straight down. Right? So you have to have that balance just like the bird has the balance. The moment you lose that balance and you start despairing, Allah's never going to forgive me. Allah's never going to forgive me. What I did, you don't know the stuff I did. I did this to that person. I can't even mention to you how bad it was. I know Allah's never going to forgive me something that Allah does not love me, and that's despair. And that's one extreme. And the other extreme is, no, I think I'm a pretty good person, I come to the masjid, once a week for Jummah, and, I attend the CIS class, and I'm a pretty good person. I make a few mistakes here and there, but I'm pretty sure Allah is going to have mercy on me. Allah is the merciful. That's another extreme. So these are 2 extremes, and we should be in between. And Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, one of the best people to manifest this. He said that, hypothetically, if Allah had announced that every single person, everyone that's ever been created is going to hell except one. It's only going to be one person. He says, I would hope that I'm that one person. And he says, and if Allah says everyone is going to paradise except one person, only one person is going to hell, he said, I would be afraid that I'm that one person. That's the balance we should have. We should have that balance in between the hope and in between the fear of Allah for all believers. Okay, for all believers. So there should be no false sense of security, nor an exaggerated sense of despair. Now, when it comes to judging a person's faith, we talked about you judge by external factors, right? Even if you have a suspicion of disbelief, right? So, even if you have a 70%, 80%, 90% suspicion that they're doing something wrong. You walk into the guy's room and you find him reading the Bible. You say, whoa, I didn't even know you read the Bible. Okay, that could happen. Muslims do read the Bible and so that's okay. This guy's okay, no problem. That's like a 10% doubt, no problem. Then all of a sudden, you're driving through the parking lot, you're driving through a shopping center, and all of a sudden you see him walking out of a church. Oh, okay, this is a little bit shady, This is like 30% doubt now. But you're supposed to make an excuse. You say, well, maybe he had a question about the Bible, he wanted to ask a pastor. So you don't need to go and spy on him. You don't need to go and start, put a GPS tracker, underneath his car, and you start tracking him. Where is he going? What is he doing? Or, call the NRA and say, can you release some of the files, from the Prism Institute, and can we find out what was really going on? You're not supposed to do that. You don't have to do that. So then all of a sudden, you walk into his room the next day, and see the guy has a crucifix on the table. You're like, okay, this is weird. So here you can ask him, what is this doing here? Say, oh, yeah, one of my Christian friends, they asked me to just keep it for them. Okay, strange, but we're like at 60% doubt, right? So then all of a sudden, you see him, I don't know, I'm running out of examples here. You see him doing something else and your doubt goes up to like 80%, 90%. You can confront him, but if he keeps denying and saying, no, that's not what's happening. You have 90% doubt, man, something is wrong with this guy. Until you have 100% clarity that he's left Islam, you're not supposed to declare him as a disbeliever. Is that clear? Hopefully that makes it clear. All right. So as long as they claim it, you accept that from them. So here is an example. Usama ibn Zayd, one of the companions of the Prophet, in fact, the adopted relative of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was in a battle one time. He was in a war. And when you're in a battle, you're trying to, get rid of the enemy, because they're going to kill you or you kill them. So what happened was he was fighting one guy, one-on-one combat, and finally he had the guy, took out his sword, shield is gone, the guy is on the floor, and he's about to finish the guy. And the moment that happened, the guy was just about to be finished off, he said, Ashhadu la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan. He declared Islam on the spot. So now the thing is, he declared Islam like literally after he lost the sword, after he lost his shield, he's literally like on the floor and he's about to get killed in the next 5 seconds. So he declared Islam. Okay, I believe in Islam now. So what did Usama ibn Zayd do? Kill the guy. Kill the guy. Some companion, now obviously why did he kill the guy? This guy's, I defeated the guy, he's just trying to save his life. So some of the companions, they watched, they saw this happen. They went back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and they told him, this is what happened, this is what Usama did. The Prophet, peace be upon him, rebuked Usama and he told him, he says, how could you do something like this? You know that if somebody accepts Islam, then they're safe and they're protected, you're not allowed to kill them. Even in the battlefield, you're not allowed to kill them. And he said, O Messenger of Allah, the guy was just doing it to save his life. He was on the floor. He was just doing it to save his life. And the Messenger of Allah, he said, did you examine his heart? Were you able to tell what was in his heart at that moment? Maybe he just woke up. There's a possibility that he just woke up at that moment. He was asleep the whole time and he woke up when he got on the floor. It just dawned on him, you know what? This is right. We're supposed to judge by external factors. So he was wrong in even killing that person. And he realized his mistake and he had to pay blood money. Because that person could have been a Muslim. Now, from our perspective, that looks like 90% chance. Or 8, whatever, we don't know the percentage, right? But it looks like the guy's just trying to save his life. But you don't know. He could have actually accepted Islam on the spot. You don't know. And he might have died a believer. So our job is to judge by external. Right? That doesn't mean that, you say, oh, mashallah, you're a Muslim, great. Here's my sword, And then just in case, let's walk, guys. And then he stabs you from the back, right? Obviously, you be careful with him. You obviously, you watch him and everything. Make sure, he's going to integrate in the community. You have to be wise, but you're not allowed to judge him. Okay? As long as somebody claims to be a believer, we must accept that. And the last point is, the Prophet ﷺ taught us to judge by outward characteristics, not only in that example, but he knew that there were hypocrites in Medina. And he knew the names of those hypocrites who are not true Muslims. But he did not expose those people. Why did he not expose them? Because he wanted to set an example for everyone else that when, your behavior towards people can change in terms of you being cautious around them. Somebody's acting weird and they look like they're doing something wrong. It doesn't mean, oh no, we treat them with open arms, I'm going to put you in a position of leadership or power. You be careful because of their actions. You judge them by their actions, but you don't judge their beliefs. If there was a responsibility to judge people by their beliefs, then all these hypocrites would have been taken out. Right? All these hypocrites would have been exposed, but they weren't. Because the Prophet wanted us to set a very clear example of these people. So that ends our class for today. Questions?
When we are talking about the teachings of the Prophet, I don't know the complete saying, but isn't there a saying that the Prophet ﷺ said that whatever comes from his mouth is from Allah?
Yes.
So
It's a verse in the Quran. He does not speak of his own doing, but it's a revelation revealed.
that's only specific to the
That's specific to the revelation. Specific.
not specific to hadith or something.
No. It's specific to anything connected to Islam. Anything connected to Islam. Anything not connected to Islam. That doesn't mean that it's binding. So, for example, I gave this example in a previous class. So, for example, when we say that we're supposed to follow the Prophet peace upon him in everything that he did, right? So, if he likes a certain type of meat, are we supposed to start liking that particular type of meat? No. If you did out of love for him, your reward is due to your love for him. It's not due to your liking and adjusting your aspect of the meat. And you don't find the companions following him and trying to all eat only that aspect, that part of the camel that that he liked or something like that. If the Prophet peace upon him used to ride on a camel, or he used to walk on the walk instead of riding or whatever it is, we don't follow all these detailed aspects because they're not part of the religion. The Prophet peace upon him did certain things in his capacity as a human being, and he did certain things in his capacity as a prophet. So we have to understand the difference between the two, and his teachings in his capacity as a prophet are 100% binding on us. We have to take them as an example. The things that he did on a normal basis are not binding on us. In terms of the type of clothing that he wore, for example. Just the exact type of clothing that he wore. Have you ever seen anyone try to exactly imitate exactly the type of material and cloth and clothing that he wore? Very rarely. People make the claim, but actually the material that they used to use and the material that they're using today, almost no one is using the same type of material. Right? Almost nobody. So it's not the exact same. When people talk about, you could take it to whatever level. You want to have the exact same size and you're not his size. Are you going to imitate him in that? So the thing is, there are things he did as a person and there are things he did on a religious level. Sunnah in Islamic law, okay, or Sunnah in these teachings is what the Prophet taught and wanted other people to follow. Okay, there's a difference. What he did and he wanted others to follow. So when he wore certain type of clothing, he wore it, but he didn't necessarily want other people to follow it. Right? When he ate at a certain period of the day, he ate at this hour of the day. This was because he's eating. Doesn't mean that he wants people to follow exactly that. So he did something that he did, but he didn't necessarily want somebody else to do. Right? So for example, going to the bathroom outside. Does that mean that to follow the Prophet, we have to go outside to go to the bathroom instead of inside? No, because that's not something, there's nothing indicated that we're supposed to follow something like that. So therefore the Sunnah, people have a wrong conception of the Sunnah. They understand Sunnah as being something that the Prophet, peace upon him, did. That's the wrong definition. Something that the Prophet, peace upon him, did and wanted others to do. That clarifies the definition. So he lived in Medina, right, for how many years? 13 years. So is it Sunnah to live in Medina for 13 years? Is it Sunnah to die at the age of 62? So, I'm gonna follow Sunnah 100%. I'm gonna do exactly what he did. Cannot be. It cannot be. Right? Yeah, in Medina, it was not 13 years in Medina, right? So I'm thinking, come on, where are the students here? Other way around, Makkah's 13 years, 10 in Medina. Yeah. 13 plus 10. Yeah, Makkah, yes. So, okay, I thought it was answered. So the thing is, if somebody believes, so there's been one group of scholars that have said if you completely abandon prayers altogether, then you go out of belief. The rest of the scholars have said that as long as you believe that all the prayers are mandatory, but you're not doing any of them, but you believe that you need to do it, and you keep on saying, I'm going to start tomorrow, I'm going to start tomorrow, and you never get around to it and you're not doing it, you're still a believer. Now there will be a punishment for you in Islamic State, right? Some scholars said the punishment for something like that is death, and the Hanafi school actually said the punishment like that for something like that is imprisonment until you change, right? But in terms of belief, the person still remains a believer, right? So the reason why this is important, there's a lot of statements, a lot of hadiths, statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which talk about a person disbelieving due to an action. So it says when someone is drinking alcohol, they're not drinking alcohol, they're in a state of disbelief while they're drinking alcohol. When someone's committing adultery, they're in a state of disbelief while they're committing adultery. So this is why, and we'll talk on the last week about another group of people who had the idea, who thought that sins take you outside of Islam. And it nullifies your belief and you're not a Muslim anymore. Yeah. They're allowed to be given zakah, but hopefully at least they pray like one time, once a month or something. But they have to believe. Clearly, they believe that they have to pray all 5 prayers. Okay, as long as they're clear on the belief, hopefully they're praying at least like once a month or once a year or something like that, at least, then yeah, they're still a believer. Now, are they the best people to receive or whatever? Hopefully, technically, you can't judge. So technically, they can receive zakah. It's a good question. How do you approach someone that doesn't accept the sunnah? This is, it really depends on the person. It really, really depends on the person and their reasons and everything. So this is a very common thing. I went through a period in my life where I rejected sunnah completely. So I know generally how to debate with them, how to discuss what their arguments are, everything. But it depends, because there are some people who just reject it like that, and there are some people who actually, they research and they have reasons for rejecting. So it all depends on who you're dealing with, right? So it's a case-by-case basis. Some people have no knowledge whatsoever. You explain to them a few things. Probably one of the best ways to start is to simply ask them, okay, you don't believe in any of the sunnah at all. Do they pray? Do they pray? So ask them, how do they learn how to pray? That's the number one starting point. And I'll tell you the answer. The answer that Rashid Khalifa gives is that you learn how to pray just by, prayer has never changed since time of Prophet Ibrahim, according to him. So everyone around the Kaaba, they've been praying non-stop since the time of Prophet Ibrahim. So you learn how to pray just by seeing the people in Mecca. That's the most ridiculous argument, and hopefully, I can explain more why it's ridiculous, but it's a ridiculous argument. So hopefully don't give them that answer, by the way. So let them answer first, and let's see what they come up with. If they come up with this, it means they've been to his websites. If they don't come up with this, it means that they don't really know what to answer. So you start with that, and then you take it from there. Okay, so somebody who curses the companions, or somebody who curses whatever it is, it depends on what their other beliefs are. And it depends, why they're doing it and what they're doing and everything. So if they don't fall into this category, they're still labeled as Muslims. So obviously you shouldn't be cursing people, you shouldn't be cursing a companion, you shouldn't be, doing all this thing. But if you believe in something which clearly goes against Islam, so this is not clear-cut that takes somebody outside of Islam. They should stop doing it, but it does not make them a disbeliever. But if somebody rejects part of the Quran, or somebody believes that their imam that they're following is above the status of a prophet, for example, or somebody believes that their imam that they follow can overrule and override what the Quran actually says, then that's disbelief. Yes, so if you have a doubt in somebody that he's a believer or not, and he's leading the prayer, are you allowed to pray behind him? Yes. Because unless your doubt is 100%, you're allowed to pray behind him. Yeah. So if somebody's following the dress of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or let's say, for example, when I was in the UK, they started selling recently this barley meal for breakfast, and they said this used to be the Prophet's breakfast. So if you take this and you mix it with certain type of water or something like that, and you eat it, right? Your eating of that does not give you any reward. But the fact that you're doing that out of love for the Prophet, your love for the Prophet gives you the reward. So that's the important thing to understand. So if somebody says, hey, why don't you eat this if you love the Prophet so you get more reward? And you say, no, you know what? I'm going to sing a song about the Prophet to show my love, and I'm going to get the same amount of reward or more, depending on how emotional, how powerful my nasheed is. or I'm going to make a poem about how much I love the Prophet, I'm going to get the same or more amount of reward for your eating of that barley for breakfast. So it's the love of the Prophet which gives you the reward, not the eating of that particular thing. Words and terms in sciences and in fields, they differ across the board. So that's just the way sciences are. The confusion is only in the minds of the average person who doesn't know anything about these fields, and we keep using colloquial terms. That's the problem. So the thing is, remove the word sunnah in your vocabulary in Islamic law and replace it with either mustahab or mandub or just leave it as recommended, right? And remove the word sunnah from your vocabulary in Islamic law, and it'll make a lot more sense, right? So there are some aspects of the Quran which have been detailed quite a bit, like for example, writing down a debt, or the details of who you're not allowed to marry, and all of these things. So there are certain times where it lists out things. The thing is, wherever it lists things out, it flows within that surah. So it has a flow, and it's been listed out for a specific reason. So it gives the surah a kind of balance and everything. So when you actually study the details of the surah, how the verses came before, how the verses came after, and what other aspects the surah needed to talk about, it actually fits in and it matches. So they're not arbitrary. There are actually specific reasons on why this many details were mentioned. And it doesn't mention all the details. So even, for example, people you're not allowed to marry, it doesn't give every single example. Like, for example, it doesn't mention, the detail of the foster family, and this foster mother, and this foster sister, and this one, and the aunt, and the thing, and if you have the two sisters, and the sister, and the aunt, and the sister, all the details are not there. So whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to put in the Quran, He put in the Quran for a specific reason. And there's so many wisdoms we can draw out of it. But ultimately we can keep on trying to figure out exactly, well, what is the reason why He included this person and why He excluded this person. We can try and find some wisdoms, but we'll never come 100% to the exact detail of why He did that. People who change their declaration of faith, they've added something to it. Though just the wording itself, maybe there's some flexibility in that. It depends on what their belief. Anything that they add to the declaration of faith that nullifies belief will nullify belief. But maybe you could say there's some leeway in adding to the declaration of faith. See, the thing is, when somebody takes the declaration of faith, and they make the declaration of faith, and they say, I believe in Allah and I believe in the Messenger of Allah. When you say you believe in the Messenger of Allah, you believe in Him as a messenger, right? So everything that He's bringing, if He's a true messenger, you wouldn't think that He's bringing right stuff and wrong stuff as a messenger, because you believe all that He brings is from Allah. So you wouldn't think that Allah is teaching anything wrong. Now, in reality, when someone first accepts the declaration of faith, they don't have this detailed understanding. They don't have the detailed understanding of all the teachings. They don't even they know the basis, but they don't know all the details and everything. So this is, like I said, this is a very high level theoretical kind of statement. This doesn't mean that you have to know and believe in everything that He brought. You have to study all the hadith. That's not what it means. It means that the moment you realize that something is clearly from the Prophet, your willingness to accept it is there. That's all it means. Well, I'm saying that it's implied, right? Because when somebody accepts the Prophet Muhammad as the Prophet, generally, whether or not they're thinking it in their mind or not, they accept that He's a prophet, a true prophet from God. And they know that God does not make mistakes. So whatever He's teaching is going to be from God, so everything that He teaches is correct. So it's already implied in the statement itself. I think the reason why, I think maybe there's a confusion is because you're thinking that, well, they haven't studied all these things in detail. Yeah. No one's saying that you have to know. Whatever you know about Him at that point in time, you believe that, and everything else that you don't know, once you know that it's from Him, you're willing to accept it. That's all it is. Why would he feel that he's the only one going to hell if everyone else went to Jannah? Because he had fear of Allah. So he was just manifesting the principle of fear. He was saying that I would be worried. That's what it means. I would have some worry in my heart. Right? So instead of saying, oh, well, that guy over there, man, that guy doesn't even pray. It's probably him. See, Omar's trying to say that, Omar's trying to say is we should always look at ourselves. That was his point. It's not like a literal statement. It's more like a principle statement that he's making. There's always an ulterior motive for rejecting the sunnah. There's usually almost always some ulterior motive. There's either ulterior motive or there's trauma. Trauma in terms of people coming and saying, you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this, the hadith says this, and the hadith says, and they're like, no, we have to do all of these things. So the trauma usually, or some ulterior motive, I don't want to follow this, I don't want to follow this. It's usually one of these two things which leads people to reject the sunnah. People don't reject the sunnah on a purely intellectual basis. They reject it on an emotional basis first, and then they try to find intellectual backing for it to justify themselves. That's usually the way it is. That's why you have to address people on an individual level. Yeah, the other books were not preserved because another prophet was going to come after them. So there was no need for their preservation. But this book needs to be preserved because there's not going to be another prophet coming afterwards. Right, that's the reason. Alcohol generally falls into the same category. Scholars say, they make one exception, is if somebody's trying to give some interpretation of something else that you can kind of understand that they're not doing it out of their own desires, but they have a legitimate misunderstanding of something. So I'll give you an example. So alcohol, I definitely would not, because I've never met a single person who says that alcohol is not forbidden in the Quran, and then they don't drink. Almost everyone who says that the Quran doesn't forbid alcohol, they want to drink, right? So there's a motivation behind it, right? So I can understand. So there's really no basis for that. And it's so clear cut. No, I'll just leave it at that. I won't give you another. I'll just leave it at that. Okay. See, the thing is, they have to have consistency. So the problem is lack of consistency. So if somebody tells you, in this one, you pray the way that you see me praying, you perform Hajj the way that you watch me perform Hajj, and they say, okay, we're going to follow that. And then he says, and then you eat this way with your hand, or you eat, or you do something like this, or you avoid this animal. And they say, well, I'm going to follow this, I'm not going to follow that. What is their explanation? The explanation of that this is a daily ritual and this is not a daily ritual. Going to the bathroom is a daily thing. It just depends on, I don't know where they're coming from. You have to figure out where they're coming from and what they're really saying. So what's their real argument? So you have to ask them, and if they say, no, we believe this was made up, say, well, why do you believe this was made up and this was not made up? They have to come up with some explanation. So what you need to do for these kind of people is basically, you need to catch them at their own game. And either tell them show them that they're being inconsistent. So what's going to end up happening is, temporarily, either they're going to follow all the sunnah, or they're going to reject all the sunnah. But even if they will say, I don't want them to reject all the sunnah, they have to be consistent. Once they reject all the sunnah, they say, okay, I don't accept anything. Then you need to reconvince them why you should follow the sunnah. Then they'll realize it's either all or it's nothing. That's the thing. That's just the only way it's going to work. So most of these guys are on YouTube, because YouTube is like the people who don't have a podium, they get a podium. So this is problematic. So khair, inshallah, may Allah help us, may Allah guide us. We're going to discuss all these details about sunnah, inshallah, in the class on sunnah and hadith next year in a lot of detail. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.